Call whoever you want, Officer Daniel Carter said, his voice cutting through the fluorescent hum like a blade that had been sharpened too many times, too comfortably, too confidently, and the room responded exactly how he expected. Low chuckles, a few louder laughs, the kind that bounced off tiled walls and metal desks like echoes of something routine, something practiced, something that had happened before and would happen again. Alicia Brooks stood there in the center of it all, wrists resting on the cold steel edge of the front desk, not restrained, not threatened, but not welcomed either, the thin fabric of her navy scrubs still carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and lavender hand soap. Her badge clipped slightly crooked after a 14-hour shift at St. Mary's Medical Center, just 3 miles down the road. Her shoes worn at the edges from pacing hospital corridors that never slept. Corridors where people whispered instead of laughed, where voices softened instead of sharpened, where presence meant something different than power. The overhead lights buzzed again, that faint electrical crackle that made everything feel just a little more exposed, a little more unreal, and Alicia blinked once, slow and steady, as if adjusting not to the brightness but to the weight of the moment itself, her eyes moving briefly, not nervously, not defensively, just observing, cataloging, the way she always did, the way she had learned to do in rooms where she wasn't expected to matter. Officer Carter leaned back against the counter, arms folded, his badge catching the light as he tilted his head just enough to look down at her. Not physically. She wasn't shorter by much, but socially, structurally, the kind of angle that came from years of being the one who asked questions instead of answered them, the one who decided when someone stayed and when someone walked out. Go ahead, he added, a smirk pulling at one corner of his mouth. Make your call. And someone behind him muttered something under their breath that drew another ripple of laughter, softer this time, more contained, like the room itself was settling into the script. Alicia didn't react to the laughter, not outwardly, not in the way they were waiting for. There was no tightening of her shoulders, no defensive shift in her stance, just a slow inhale that lifted her chest slightly before settling again, controlled, measured, the kind of breath you take when you've spent hours keeping someone else alive and know that panic never helps, that noise never heals. She reached into the pocket of her scrub top, fingers brushing past a folded note, a pen, a pair of gloves still sealed in plastic, before finding her phone, the screen lighting up faintly against her palm, casting a soft glow that contrasted sharply with the harsh white above, and for a second, just a second, the room seemed to quiet, not completely, but enough that the hum of the lights felt louder, the scrape of a chair more noticeable, the shift of weight from one officer to another more deliberate. Carter watched her closely now, not because he expected anything to change, but because he didn't expect it to, because in his mind, this was already decided, already understood, already over. Alicia's thumb hovered over the screen, not trembling, not hesitant, just precise, like she was selecting the right medication dosage, like she was counting heartbeats, like she understood that what came next didn't need volume, didn't need force, only clarity. She tapped once, then again, bringing the phone to her ear, her posture straightening not in defiance, but in quiet certainty. And somewhere behind Carter, someone let out a small, impatient sigh, as if the moment was taking too long, as if the outcome was supposed to be faster, easier, more predictable. Alicia didn't look at any of them now, her gaze fixed slightly downward, her expression calm, almost distant, but not disconnected, present in a way that didn't ask permission. The line rang once, twice, the sound barely audible, but somehow louder than the laughter had been. And Carter shifted his stance just slightly, his smirk still there, but thinner now, less certain, like something unseen had entered the room and changed the air pressure without anyone acknowledging it. Alicia's lips parted just enough to speak as the call connected, her voice low, steady, carrying no edge, no fear, just a simple, grounded truth as she said, "Hi, it's Alicia." And in that moment, before anyone on the other end responded, before any name was spoken, before any title could reshape the space, the room held its breath without realizing it, suspended between what it thought it knew and what it was about to learn. The voice on the other end did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, not empty, but measured, like someone deciding how to enter a room they already owned. Alicia stood still, phone held steady against her ear, her breathing even, her gaze fixed somewhere just past the reflection of fluorescent light on the polished counter, while across from her Officer Carter shifted his weight again, the heel of his boot scraping faintly against the floor in. A sound that seemed louder now than it should have been. One of the officers behind him leaned closer, trying to catch whatever voice might come through the tiny speaker, but there was nothing yet, only the soft ambient hum of a connection that had not been dismissed. Then, finally, a voice came through, low and controlled, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry authority. "Alicia," it said, not questioning her identity, but confirming it, and something subtle changed in her expression, not relief, not fear, just recognition. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone respectful but not submissive, grounded in familiarity rather than distance. And that single word, "sir," landed differently in the room than anything else had so far, because it was not directed at the officers around her, it was directed somewhere beyond them. Carter's smirk tightened, not gone but restrained, as he tilted his head slightly, listening now with more focus than before, his arms unfolding without him realizing it, his posture shifting from casual to attentive in increments so small they would have gone unnoticed in any other moment. "Are you safe?" the voice asked, still calm, still precise, and Alicia glanced up briefly, her eyes meeting Carter's for just a second before returning to the neutral space in front of her. "I am at the precinct on West 8th, she said, each word clear, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. And somewhere behind Carter, a chair creaked as someone straightened up. The voice on the phone paused again, but this time the silence carried weight, not uncertainty, more like a calculation being completed. "Put the phone on speaker," it said, and the request was not framed as a question. Alicia did not hesitate, her thumb moving across the screen with the same calm precision she used when adjusting a patient's monitor, and as the speaker activated, the faint background noise of the other side came through. Distant voices, the soft shuffle of papers, the kind of controlled environment that mirrored authority rather than chaos. "This is Officer Carter," he said suddenly, stepping forward half a pace as if reclaiming space that had not been taken from him yet, his voice firm, practiced, but just a shade louder than necessary. "Who am I speaking with?" And for the first time since the call began, the room leaned into the answer, every small movement stilled, every breath measured. There was no rush in the response, no need to prove anything quickly, and when the voice returned, it carried the same steady tone, but now with a clarity that cut through the room like a line being drawn. "This is Governor Raymond Hale," it said, each word distinct, unhurried, unmistakable, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but absolute. Like the air itself had shifted direction, the laughter that had filled the room minutes ago had no place to land now. It simply vanished, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than silence. And Carter's expression changed not dramatically, not all at once, but in fragments, the corners of his mouth flattening, his jaw setting, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in recalibration. Alicia remained still, her hands steady, her posture unchanged, but the space around her had altered, the invisible line that had placed her on one side of the room and everyone else on the other no longer held the same shape. "Governor," Carter said, his tone adjusting mid-word, the confidence still there but now threaded with caution. "We were just," but he stopped, because the sentence he had started no longer fit the moment he was in, and for the first time since Alicia had walked into the precinct, the man who had controlled the room was listening instead of leading. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and precise, and for a moment no one in the room moved, as if motion itself required permission that had not yet been granted. Alicia's phone remained steady in her hand, the soft glow of the screen reflecting faintly against her fingers while the governor's voice carried through the speaker with quiet authority. "Officer Carter," he continued, not raising his tone, not repeating himself, just placing the name exactly where it needed to be, and Carter straightened fully now, his shoulders pulling back, his stance aligning into something more formal, more controlled, the casual edge gone from his posture as if it had never belonged there in the first place. "Yes, sir," Carter replied, The words are landing differently this time. Not tossed casually into the air, but placed carefully, deliberately. And somewhere behind him, one of the officers cleared his throat softly. Another shifted a step back, the invisible lines of hierarchy redrawing themselves without a single command being spoken. "I understand there is a situation involving Ms. Brooks," the governor said, each syllable measured, and Alicia did not look up, did not seek validation in the moment. She simply listened, her breathing still even, her presence unchanged, but the space around her continued to evolve. The distance that had once defined her role in the room now dissolving into something less certain, less controlled. Carter glanced briefly at Alicia, then back toward the phone, his eyes narrowing not in defiance but in focus. "We are conducting a routine stop, sir," he said, choosing each word carefully as if aware that language itself had become evidence. There were some concerns about identification, and the explanation hung in the air, thinner than it had sounded in his own head, less complete than it had been minutes before. The governor did not respond immediately, and that pause carried more weight than any interruption could have, the kind of silence that invited reflection without asking for it. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something firmer, something that did not challenge but clarified. "Ms. Brooks just completed a 14-hour shift at St. Mary's Medical Center," he said, the detail landing with quiet precision. "She has been part of a critical care team that handled an emergency case earlier tonight." And one of the officers in the back straightened slightly, recognition flickering across his face as if pieces were connecting in a way they had not before. Alicia's gaze lowered a fraction, not in discomfort, but in acknowledgement. Her shoulders still relaxed, her stance grounded in something deeper than the room could define, and Carter's jaw tightened just enough to register the shift, not outwardly defensive, but internally adjusting, recalibrating the narrative he had been holding onto. "Is there a specific reason she is being detained?" the governor asked, the question simple, direct, leaving no space for interpretation, and Carter opened his mouth to respond, then paused, because the answer he had prepared no longer carried the same certainty, the same weight. "We were verifying," he began, but the sentence faltered, not because he did not have words, but because the words no longer aligned with the moment. Alicia's phone remained on the counter now, speaker still active, her hand resting lightly beside it. Fingers relaxed, not gripping, not defensive, just present, and the room around her felt smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way power had shifted its center without announcing it. "Officer," the governor said, his tone unchanged but unmistakably firm, "I would like Ms. Brooks to be allowed to leave immediately." And there was no emphasis on the word like, no urgency in the phrasing, just a clarity that made the request feel less like a suggestion and more like an outcome already decided. Carter inhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, his eyes moving once more to Alicia, not assessing now, not measuring, but seeing in a way he had not before, and for the first time since the interaction began, the room was not waiting for his next move. It was waiting for him to understand the moment he was in. The request did not hang in the air, it settled into it, firm and undeniable, and for a long second Officer Carter did not speak, his eyes fixed somewhere between Alicia and the phone, as if recalculating a version of events that no longer matched what he was hearing, the muscles in his jaw tightening before releasing again, a subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed in any other room, but here, under the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet attention of every officer present, it carried weight. Alicia remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her hand still resting lightly beside the phone, her presence calm in a way that did not demand recognition but naturally drew it, and the contrast between her stillness and the room's growing tension made everything feel sharper, more defined, like edges coming into focus. "Understood, sir," Carter finally said, his voice controlled, measured, each word placed carefully as if testing the ground beneath it, and as he spoke he reached forward, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to slide the phone a few inches closer to Alicia, a small gesture that marked a shift more clearly than any apology could have. Behind him, one of the younger officers straightened fully, his earlier expression of amusement gone entirely, replaced by something quieter, something more observant. while another officer lowered his gaze to the desk in front of him. Avoiding direct eye contact with anyone at all, Ms. Brooks will be free to go, Carter continued, the statement sounding almost procedural but carrying a new tone beneath it, one that acknowledged not just the instruction he had received, but the reality he had been forced to recognize. There was a pause, and then the governor's voice returned, still calm, still precise. "Thank you, officer." And for the first time since the call began, there was the faintest trace of something human in it. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement, as if the situation had moved from correction to resolution. Alicia lifted the phone again, bringing it back to her ear, her movements unhurried, her voice quiet but clear. "Thank you, sir," she said, and there was no need for more words. No need to explain or justify. The simplicity of it carried its own completeness. She ended the call with a soft tap of her thumb, and the moment the line disconnected, the room did not return to what it had been before. It remained suspended in something new, something unsettled. Carter exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible. And for a second, he looked at Alicia directly, not over her, not past her, but at her, as if seeing her for the first time without the assumptions that had shaped his earlier judgment. "You are all set," he said, his tone formal now, stripped of the earlier edge, and he stepped slightly to the side, creating space where there had been none before. Alicia nodded once, not in gratitude, not in submission, but in simple acknowledgement, and she reached for her belongings, adjusting her badge, smoothing the front of her scrubs with a small, absent motion that spoke more to habit than discomfort. As she turned toward the door, the soft rubber soles of her shoes made almost no sound against the floor, and yet every step felt amplified in the quiet, each movement marking the distance between what had been and what was now undeniable. No one spoke as she walked past the line of desks, past the officers who no longer met her with laughter or dismissal, but with something quieter, something closer to reflection. When she reached the door, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to look back, not to say anything, but simply to breathe, the cool air from outside brushing against her face as she pushed it open. The night beyond was still, the streetlights casting long, steady lines across the pavement, and as she stepped out into that space, the door closed softly behind her, sealing the room in its silence, leaving Officer Carter standing where he was, the echo of the moment lingering not in sound, but in understanding that could not be undone. The night air felt different the moment Alicia stepped onto the sidewalk, cooler than it had any right to be after a long shift, carrying with it the faint hum of distant traffic and the steady glow of streetlights stretching down west. 8 like quiet witnesses to everything that had just happened, and for a moment she did not move forward. She simply stood there, her shoulders rising slightly with a slow breath as if letting the weight of the room behind her fall away in pieces too small to see, but heavy enough to feel. Inside the precinct, the silence did not break when the door closed. It deepened, settling over the desks and chairs and polished floors in a way that made every small sound stand out. The soft tap of a pen against a clipboard, the low crackle of a radio, the faint rustle of paper shifting under someone's hand. Officer Carter remained where he was, his gaze still fixed on the door long after it had shut, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught somewhere between the authority he had carried into the moment and the realization that had followed it. And when he finally turned back toward the room, the expressions around him had changed, not dramatically, not confrontationally, but enough that he could feel it without anyone needing to say a word. One of the younger officers cleared his throat again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "She did not seem out of line," he said, the words careful, measured, not challenging but not fully aligned either. And Carter nodded once, a small motion that acknowledged more than it explained. He walked back toward the desk slowly, his boots making a steady, muted rhythm against the floor, and he reached for the report that had been left open, the lines of text suddenly less certain than they had been before, the details he had written earlier feeling incomplete, not because they were wrong in structure, but because they were missing something essential, something he had not seen when it mattered most. Outside, Alicia began to walk, her steps even, unhurried, the pavement stretching out beneath her as the city moved around her in quiet continuity. A car passing at a distance, a faint breeze brushing against her sleeves, and she adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, a familiar motion that grounded her in the present. Her phone rested in her hand now, the screen dark, the call already behind her, and she did not look back at the building, not out of defiance, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing there she needed to carry forward. Inside, Carter sat down at the desk, the chair creaking softly under his weight as he leaned forward, elbows resting lightly, his hands coming together in a way that was more reflective than authoritative, and he stared at the report again, the words routine stop no longer fitting as cleanly as they had before. He picked up the pen, hesitated for a brief second, then drew a slow line through a portion of the text, not erasing it entirely, but marking it as something that needed reconsideration, and the act itself felt heavier than it should have, as if acknowledging the gap between what had been assumed and what had been real. Another officer approached quietly, placing a file down on the desk without comment, and for a moment they stood there in shared silence, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, the kind of silence that followed understanding rather than confusion. Carter exhaled again, slower this time, and leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the door once more, not expecting it to open, not expecting anything to change immediately, but aware that something already had, something that would not be undone by routine or habit. Outside, Alicia reached the corner, the crosswalk signal shifting from red to white, and she stepped forward with the same steady rhythm she had carried through hospital halls and quiet rooms, her presence unchanged, her path continuing not because of what had happened, but in spite of it. And as the light shifted behind her, the city moved on, but the moment remained, not in the air, not in the sound, but in the quiet understanding left behind. The city carried on without pause, its rhythm steady and indifferent, but for Alicia each step felt deliberate, grounded in something deeper than routine, her shoes brushing against the concrete in a soft, even cadence as she moved past closed storefronts and dimly lit windows, the glow from a corner diner spilling onto the sidewalk in warm contrast to the cool streetlights above, and she adjusted her jacket slightly, not because she was cold, but because the motion gave her something familiar to hold on to after a moment that had shifted more than it had shown. Her phone remained in her hand, quiet now, its weight subtle but present, and she slipped it into her pocket as she reached the bus stop just ahead, the metal bench catching the light in a dull reflection, empty except for a folded newspaper left behind by someone else's day. She sat down slowly, her posture still composed, her gaze resting forward, as if watching something beyond the street itself. And for a moment she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in a brief pause that allowed everything to settle, the voices, the silence, the shift that had taken place inside that room. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had not returned to its earlier state. It had changed in ways that could not be undone by noise or routine, and Officer Carter remained at his desk, the report still open in front of him, the ink of his earlier words drying into something that no longer felt complete, and he read the line again. Routine stop, his pen resting just above it as if waiting for instruction that would not come. The younger officer who had spoken earlier lingered nearby, his posture uncertain, not out of fear but out of thought, and he glanced toward Carter before speaking again, quieter this time. "She did not argue," he said, as if trying to understand something that did not fit the pattern he had been taught, and Carter nodded once, the motion slower now, heavier. "No," he replied, his voice low, almost reflective. "She did not." And the simplicity of that truth carried more weight than the report in front of him. He leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under the shift, and his gaze drifted to the door again, not expecting it to open, not expecting her to return, but recognizing that the moment had not ended when she walked out. It had stayed, settled into the space, into the way the room felt, into the way he now saw it. Outside, a bus approached in the distance, its headlights cutting a steady path through the night, and Alicia opened her eyes as the sound grew closer, her attention returning to the present without urgency, without hesitation, and she stood as the bus came to a stop, the doors opening with a soft mechanical sigh. She stepped forward, her movements calm, her presence unchanged, and as she reached into her pocket for her fare, she paused for just a second, her fingers brushing against her phone again, the memory of the call not sharp or overwhelming, but steady, like something that did not need to be revisited to be understood. She boarded the bus, offering a quiet nod to the driver, and took a seat near the window, the glass reflecting a faint image of her face against the passing lights. And as the bus pulled away, the city continued to move, the streets stretching ahead in long, quiet lines. Back inside the precinct, Carter finally lowered his pen, drawing a slow breath as he made another mark on the page, not correcting, not erasing, but adding, filling in what had been missing. And though the words themselves were simple, the act carried something more. A shift in how he would see the next person who stood in front of that desk, a recognition that what appeared routine could carry something deeper, something worth pausing for. The hum of the lights remained. The radio crackled softly, but the room no longer felt the same. And as the night continued, the silence that followed was not empty. It was aware, holding the weight of a moment that had quietly rewritten the way it would be remembered. The bus moved steadily through the city, its low engine hum blending with the quiet rhythm of tires against asphalt. And Alicia sat by the window, her reflection faint against the glass as passing streetlights stretched into soft streaks of gold and white, each one fading behind her as quickly as it appeared, and she rested her hands loosely in her lap, her shoulders no longer carrying the tension of the precinct, but not entirely free of it either, as if the moment had settled into her not as a burden, but as something to be understood over time. A few rows ahead, a man adjusted his coat. A woman scrolled slowly through her phone, the ordinary details of the ride continuing without interruption, and Alicia watched it all with the same quiet awareness she carried into every room, every shift, every conversation. Her presence steady, her thoughts moving not in sharp reactions but in measured reflections. Inside the precinct, the night continued, but its rhythm had shifted in ways that were not immediately visible. And Officer Carter remained at his desk longer than usual, the report now filled with careful additions that extended beyond procedure into something closer to accountability, his handwriting slower, more deliberate, each line considered before it was placed on the page. And when he finally set the pen down, he did not reach for the next task right away. He simply sat there, his gaze resting on the words as if weighing them against something deeper than policy. The younger officer who had lingered earlier stepped closer again, his expression no longer uncertain but curious. "You knew who she was?" he asked quietly, not accusing, not defensive, just seeking clarity, and Carter shook his head once. The motion small but honest. "No," he said, his voice low. "I did not." And the admission did not carry shame as much as it carried recognition, a realization that what had mattered was not who she knew, but how she had been seen before that call was ever made. The officer nodded slowly, absorbing that, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy but thoughtful, as if both were considering the same question from different angles. Outside, the bus slowed as it approached another stop, the soft hiss of the brakes marking a pause in its steady motion, and Alicia shifted slightly, her gaze moving from the window to the aisle, then back again, her reflection catching her eyes for just a second before blending into the passing lights. And she reached into her bag, pulling out a small folded paper, a schedule for her next shift, the times marked in neat print, the hours stretching ahead in the same way they always had, unchanged by what had happened, grounded in the work that defined her more than any single moment ever could. She smoothed the paper once, then folded it again, placing it back carefully, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and when the bus began to move again, she leaned back slightly, her head resting against the cool glass. As the city continued to pass by, inside the precinct, Carter stood up at last, the chair sliding back with a soft sound, and he walked toward the door, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a quiet intention that had not been there earlier. And as he reached for the handle, he paused briefly, his hand resting against the metal as if acknowledging the threshold before him. The space where assumptions had once guided his actions now replaced by something more aware, more deliberate. He stepped outside, the night air meeting him with the same cool steadiness it had offered Alicia, and he looked down the street, not expecting to see her, not searching for resolution in a single glance, but recognizing that the moment had extended beyond the walls he had just left, into the way he would carry himself forward, into the way he would see the next person who stood before him. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, the city moving quietly around him, and as he stood there for a moment, the echo of what had happened did not fade. It settled, shaping something that would not need to be spoken to be understood, a shift that had begun in silence and would continue in the same way, steady, present, and impossible to ignore. The bus slowed again as it neared Alicia's stop, the soft chimes signaling its approach blending into the low murmur of the city beyond the windows, and she opened her eyes slowly, lifting her head from the glass with a quiet breath, as if returning fully to the present after letting the night settle inside her in its own time. She stood before the bus came to a complete stop, steady and composed, one hand resting lightly on the rail as the vehicle eased forward the final few feet, and when the doors opened with a gentle hiss, she stepped down onto the sidewalk without hesitation, her shoes meeting the pavement with the same quiet certainty she carried through every space she entered. The street here was calmer, residential, lined with small homes and dim porch lights that glowed like soft markers of rest, and Alicia adjusted her bag on her shoulder as she began to walk, her pace unhurried, her posture relaxed but grounded, the kind of presence that did not demand attention, yet carried its own quiet strength. Inside the precinct, Officer Carter remained outside for a moment longer, the cool air settling against his uniform as he watched the street stretch out in front of him, empty but not silent. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional passing car reminding him that the world beyond his decisions continued regardless of how he chose to act within it. He turned back toward the door slowly, his hand resting on the handle before he stepped inside again, the familiar space greeting him with the same fluorescent light and low ambient noise. Yet nothing about it felt exactly the same as before. The younger officer looked up as Carter returned, their eyes meeting briefly, and this time there was no question in the glance, only a shared awareness that something had shifted in a way that did not need to be explained. Carter moved back to his desk, but he did not sit immediately. Instead, he stood there, looking at the report once more, the lines he had written earlier now surrounded by the additions he had made. And for a moment he reached for the paper as if to close it, then stopped, his fingers resting lightly on the edge, reconsidering. He picked up the pen again, not to correct, not to erase, but to add one more line, something simple, something that did not belong to procedure, but to understanding. And as the ink settled onto the page, he exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the hum of the room. Outside, Alicia reached the small set of steps leading to her apartment building, the metal railing cool beneath her hand as she ascended, each step measured, each movement unhurried. And when she reached the door, she paused for just a second, her fingers brushing against the handle as she took a quiet breath, not from exhaustion but from the simple recognition of being home. She stepped inside, the hallway dim but familiar, the soft scent of clean linen and something faintly floral lingering in the air, and she closed the door behind her with a gentle click that felt final in a way the precinct door had not because it ended something, but because it marked a return to herself. Back at the precinct, Carter finally sat down, the chair settling beneath him as he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk not in command but in thought, and he looked at the report one last time before closing it, the motion slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging that what had been written was no longer just a record of an event, but a marker of a change he would carry forward. The room continued around him, the radio crackling softly, papers shifting, footsteps moving across the floor, but beneath it all there was a quiet awareness that had not been there before, something unspoken yet present, shaping the way each person held themselves in that space. Outside, the night deepened, the streetlights casting steady pools of light along the quiet road, and inside her apartment, Alicia set her bag down gently, her movements calm, her presence unchanged, and as she stood there for a moment, the silence around her did not feel empty. It felt complete, holding the weight of what had happened without needing to revisit it, a quiet resolution that did not come from words, but from the simple truth of having remained who she was through it all. The apartment settled into quiet the way only late hours could allow, not empty, but full in a softer way, the kind of stillness that carried the weight of a long day without pressing it any further. and Alicia moved through the space with the same calm rhythm she had carried all night, setting her bag on the small wooden table by the door, slipping off her shoes one at a time, placing them neatly beside each other, as if the simple act restored a sense of order that did not need to be spoken. The faint glow from a single lamp in the corner stretched across the room, catching the edge of a framed photograph on the wall, the outline of a chair, the folded blanket draped across the couch, and she paused for a moment in that light, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the final tension of the night released, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a quiet shift that only she could feel. Her phone rested in her hand again, not out of urgency, not out of habit, but as something she had not yet set aside, and she looked at it briefly, the dark screen reflecting a faint image of her face before she placed it gently on the table, the soft contact barely making a sound. Across the city, the precinct continued its slow return to routine, but something beneath it had changed in a way that would not fully disappear, and Officer Carter remained at his desk, the report now closed, his hands resting flat against the surface as he looked at nothing in particular, his thoughts moving not in sharp conclusions, but in steady reconsideration, the kind that reshaped understanding rather than replaced it. The overhead lights hummed as they always had. The radio crackled with distant updates. Footsteps moved across the floor in familiar patterns, yet each sound seemed to carry a new awareness, as if the room itself had absorbed what had happened and was now holding it in quiet reflection. One of the officers passed by Carter's desk and paused briefly, not to speak, not to question, but to acknowledge, a small nod that carried more meaning than words would have, and Carter returned it just as simply. The exchange brief, but grounded in something shared. Back in her apartment, Alicia moved toward the window, her hand resting lightly against the cool glass as she looked out at the street below. The same street she had walked just minutes before, now seen from a different angle, the streetlights casting steady pools of light along the pavement, the occasional car passing through without urgency. And she stood there for a moment, not thinking of what had happened in fragments or replaying it in detail, but understanding it as a whole, something that did not define her, did not change her, but revealed something about the world she moved through and the way she chose to stand within it. She reached up and turned off the lamp, the room dimming into a softer shadow where shapes remained but edges faded, and in that quiet she moved toward the hallway, her steps unhurried, her presence unchanged, carrying with her the same steady dignity that had filled every space she had entered that night. At the precinct, Carter finally stood, pushing his chair back with a gentle motion, and he walked once more toward the door, not out of restlessness, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet need to stand where the moment had shifted. And when he stepped outside, the night met him again, cool and steady, the same streetlights casting their long lines across the pavement. He looked out at the empty road, not searching, not expecting, just observing, and for a moment he closed his eyes, the sounds of the city settling around him, the memory of the voice on the phone, the calm presence of the woman who had stood in front of him without raising her voice, without losing herself. And when he opened them again, the street remained unchanged, but his understanding of it had not. Back inside, the room waited, the work